Ever wondered about the dark side of history that rarely makes it into the textbooks? During the Vietnam War, many Vietnamese women who engaged with American soldiers faced severe and unforgiving retribution. Their interactions with foreign troops not only marked them as targets of severe punishment, but also highlighted a period fraught with societal and personal betrayals. So come along as we delve into the harrowing consequences faced by Vietnamese women who dared to forge relationships with American soldiers. Relationships in the midst of war. The Vietnam War, with its chaos and devastation, was an extraordinary time that reshaped countless lives, especially those of Vietnamese women. In the war-torn country, American soldiers stationed far from home encountered Vietnamese women in their daily lives. These interactions often led to relationships that were complex, controversial, and fraught with both promise and peril. Many of these relationships started out of necessity. Picture a young Vietnamese woman in the midst of war with resources scarce and survival uncertain. American soldiers, with their access to money, food, and goods, represented not just a lifeline, but sometimes the only hope for a better future. For some women, the relationship with an American soldier was a strategic choice, a means to ensure safety and stability for themselves and their families. In a war zone, such decisions often became a matter of life and death. However, the nature of these relationships was rarely straightforward. Some connections were genuine, born out of mutual affection or respect. Love can blossom even in the most unlikely of places. Stories abound of American soldiers and Vietnamese women forming deep, meaningful bonds despite the backdrop of conflict. These relationships, though less common, were real and poignant. Yet for many women, the relationships were far from consensual. The power dynamics at play were heavily skewed, with American soldiers holding significant influence. There were instances where relationships were coerced or born out of desperation, with women feeling they had little choice but to acquiesce. In such a turbulent environment, the line between consensual and coerced relationships is often blurred, making these situations even more heartbreaking. The complexities didn't end there. Women who entered into relationships with American soldiers had to navigate a minefield of societal judgment and personal turmoil. They were acutely aware of the potential repercussions. Vietnamese society, deeply rooted in Confucian values, emphasized purity, loyalty, and family honor. A woman who was perceived to have betrayed these values by associating with the enemy faced severe stigma and punishment. The societal backlash was particularly harsh in rural areas where traditional values held even more sway. Families of women who had relationships with Americans were often ostracized, their social standing irreparably damaged. In urban areas, while slightly more progressive, the stigma was still significant. Women who had relationships with American soldiers were often seen as traitors or collaborators. This label, regardless of the circumstances leading to their relationships, stuck with them long after the soldiers had gone. It was a mark of shame that they and their families struggled to erase. Physical and psychological punishments. The punishments meted out to Vietnamese women who were perceived to have fraternized with American soldiers during the Vietnam War were both brutal and heartbreaking. These women faced a society that demanded retribution for what was seen as betrayal, and the measures taken to punish them were as varied as they were cruel. Let's start with the physical punishments. These could range from beatings to outright torture. Often, these acts of violence were carried out publicly to serve as a grim warning to others. Imagine being dragged out in front of your entire village, beaten with sticks or fists, while everyone you know is forced to watch. It wasn't just the physical pain that was inflicted, but the deep humiliation and the lasting scars that came with it. Some women were even subjected to mutilation, an unthinkable act meant to permanently mark them as traitors. One particularly degrading form of punishment was the forced shaving of the head. In many cultures, including Vietnamese, a woman's hair is a symbol of beauty and pride. Being forcibly shaved bald was not only a physical assault, but also a psychological one. Women were often paraded through their villages with their heads shaved, sometimes with signs hung around their necks declaring their supposed crimes. This public shaming was designed to strip them of their dignity and identity. The psychological torment didn't end there. Ostracization was a common punishment, and it could be just as devastating as physical violence. These women were often shunned by their families and communities, cut off from their social support networks that everyone needs to survive and thrive. Imagine being disowned by your family, having doors slammed in your face, and being treated as an outcast wherever you went. This isolation led to severe mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, and in some tragic cases, suicide. Verbal abuse was another tool used to break these women down. They were called names, ridiculed, and blamed for the hardships their communities faced. The relentless verbal assaults served to reinforce their status as pariahs and to remind them constantly of their alleged betrayals. Forced labor and re-education camps. Among the harshest of the brutal punishments were the forced labor and re-education camps. The communist government established these camps to punish and reform those deemed traitors or collaborators. The reality, however, was a harsh and often dehumanizing experience that left deep scars on those who survived them. Forced labor camps were places of grueling work, inadequate food, and constant surveillance. These women were often forced to perform backbreaking labor such as constructing infrastructure, working in fields, or engaging in other physically demanding tasks. The conditions were typically dire, with little regard for the health and well-being of the inmates. Malnutrition, illness, and injuries were common, exacerbated by the lack of medical care and the relentless demands of work. The psychological toll was just as severe. Being in a forced labor camp meant constant indoctrination with communist ideology. Women were subjected to endless propaganda sessions designed to break their spirits and reprogram their minds. These sessions were grueling, both mentally and emotionally, as they involved public self-criticism and denunciations, which were intended to erode personal dignity and foster a sense of helplessness. The aim was clear: to strip away any remnants of loyalty to the old regime or to their American partners and replace it with an unwavering allegiance to the communist government. Re-education camps, on the other hand, were slightly different, but no less brutal. The term re-education might sound harmless, even constructive, but in practice, it was for systemic abuse and brainwashing. These camps combined forced labor with ideological reconditioning. The women were not only expected to perform hard labor, but also to participate in intensive indoctrination programs. The regime's goal was to completely transform their thinking and behavior to align with communist ideals. Life in these camps was a relentless cycle of toil and indoctrination. The women were often isolated from their families and communities, adding to their sense of despair and abandonment. Communication with the outside world was heavily restricted, making it difficult for them to know if their loved ones were safe or even alive. This isolation served the dual purpose of preventing any influence from the outside and reinforcing the women's dependency on the camp authorities. The impact of this treatment was devastating. Many women emerged from these camps physically weakened and mentally traumatized. The scars, both seen and unseen, were lasting. The constant stress and harsh conditions led to long-term health problems, while the psychological trauma often manifested in anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Reintegrating into society was an uphill battle, as the stigma of having been in these camps persisted, further isolating them from their communities. The mixed-race children. The relationships between Vietnamese women and American soldiers often resulted in the birth of mixed-race children known as Amerindians, who face unique challenges and harsh treatment, becoming innocent victims of a complex conflict. These children, embodying the reminder of the enemy, endured a lifetime of stigma and discrimination. From birth, Amerindians were viewed with suspicion and contempt by both Vietnamese and American communities. In Vietnam, they symbolized betrayal and collaboration with the enemy, challenging cultural and nationalistic values. Despite having no control over their parentage, they bore the brunt of societal resentment. Bullying and discrimination were rampant. In school, they were ostracized and taunted with names and insults highlighting their mixed heritage. Growing up amidst deep-seated prejudice and hostility was a heavy burden for these children. Employment opportunities were bleak. Many faced significant barriers, with employers influenced by societal prejudices reluctant to hire them. This economic marginalization deepened their isolation and struggle. Many Amerasians were abandoned or placed in orphanages, where conditions were often deplorable, overcrowded, underfunded, and lacking resources. Neglect, malnutrition, and a lack of emotional support left lasting scars on their well-being. Those not in orphanages often had tumultuous home lives. Mothers who kept their Amerasian children faced immense pressure and scrutiny, making it difficult to provide a stable environment. The bond between mother and child was continually tested by societal rejection. After the war, hardships intensified. The post-war Vietnamese government viewed those associated with Americans with suspicion and contempt. The U.S. government initiated the Amerasian Homecoming Act in 1987, allowing Amerasian children and their immediate families to immigrate to the U.S., offering them a chance at a better life. However, the program's implementation was challenging. Proving Amerasian status and navigating bureaucratic hurdles was complex. Some families were torn apart, and the transition to life in the U.S. brought cultural adaptation, language barriers, and employment struggles. For those who remained in Vietnam, life continued to be difficult, haunted by their past relationships with American soldiers. Those who immigrated faced a new beginning, but struggled to reconcile their pasts with their new lives.